The colored fabric strips wrapped around the wooden pole were barely visible through the driving snow, but Nathaniel Carver could see them well enough to know he was still alive. He had been walking for 6 hours through a blizzard so thick he couldn't see his own hands when he held them at arm's length, following markers he had planted himself 5 months earlier. Behind him, 2 other trappers were already dead, lost within 200 yards of their own cabins, walking in circles until exhaustion and cold claimed them. The system Nathaniel had developed after watching his partner freeze to death just half a mile from safety would save his life today and dozens of others over the next 20 years. But it had started with a tragedy so close to home it changed everything he thought he knew about surviving in the mountains. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever been caught in a true whiteout. And if stories of forgotten, frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of mountain survival is even more remarkable than this one. The marker pole stood 8 feet tall, with strips of blue, red, and green fabric wrapped around it at chest height. Nathaniel Carver gripped it with both hands, catching his breath, ice crystals clinging to his beard. The wind howled across the Montana landscape with a fury he had rarely experienced in 9 winters of trapping. He could see perhaps 10 feet in any direction. Beyond that was nothing but white chaos. He had been following these poles for 3 hours, moving from one to the next, never losing sight of the previous marker until the next appeared. Without them, he would already be dead. He knew this with absolute certainty because he had seen what happened to men who tried to navigate blizzards using traditional methods. He had buried one of them himself. The memory came back sharp and cold as the wind cutting through his layers of wool and leather. November of 1834. Daniel Morrison, his trapping partner for 3 seasons, had left their cabin to check the southern trap line. It was a routine task, something Daniel had done hundreds of times. The trap line ran along a creek bed less than a mile from their camp. The weather had been clear when Daniel left at dawn. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up. By noon, snow was falling so heavily that Nathaniel couldn't see the woodpile 20 feet from the cabin door. He had waited, assuming Daniel would recognize the changing weather and return immediately. Trappers learned to read storms. They knew when to push forward and when to retreat. Daniel was experienced and careful. But by late afternoon, when the snow showed no signs of stopping and Daniel hadn't returned, Nathaniel began to worry. By dusk, he was loading his rifle and preparing to search. By full dark, he knew something was terribly wrong. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. Nathaniel searched for Daniel as soon as there was enough light to see, following what he thought was the route to the southern trap line. The snow was knee-deep in places, waist-deep in others where the wind had created drifts. He called Daniel's name until his voice was hoarse. He fired his rifle at intervals, hoping the sound would guide his partner toward him. He found nothing but wind and snow and the growing certainty that Daniel was gone. The storm finally broke on the second day. Nathaniel resumed his search under clear skies, moving systematically through the area around their cabin. He found Daniel 3 hours after sunrise, frozen solid, sitting upright against a pine tree. The location shocked Nathaniel more than finding the body itself. Daniel had died less than 200 yards from their cabin. The cabin was visible from where Daniel sat. In clear weather, he could have seen the smoke from their chimney. But in the blizzard, he had been completely lost. Nathaniel knelt in the snow beside Daniel's body and tried to understand what had happened. The evidence was there in the disturbed snow around the tree, in the pattern of footprints that circled and doubled back on themselves. Daniel hadn't simply sat down and given up. He had been moving, searching, trying to find his way back. The footprints told a story of confusion and desperation. They wandered in loops and spirals, sometimes coming within 50 yards of the cabin before veering away again into the forest. Daniel's rifle was still loaded. His powder horn was full. He hadn't been injured or attacked. He had died because he couldn't find his way home through 200 yards of forest he knew intimately. In clear weather, Daniel could have walked that distance blindfolded. But in the blizzard, with visibility reduced to arm's length and every landmark erased by driving snow, the familiar had become utterly alien. He had wandered until exhaustion and cold had forced him to stop. Then he had frozen to death within sight of safety. Nathaniel carried Daniel's body back to the cabin. The weight felt wrong, the frozen limbs rigid and awkward. He laid his partner on the workbench inside and sat beside him for an hour, not thinking, not planning, just sitting in the silence. The cabin felt too large, with only one person breathing. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched away in all directions, beautiful and indifferent, and absolutely deadly to men who made mistakes. He buried Daniel the next day in ground that was already starting to freeze. The work took most of the morning. He piled stones over the grave to keep animals away and carved Daniel's name into a flat piece of wood he nailed to a tree. The marker wouldn't last more than a few years before weather destroyed it, but that seemed appropriate somehow. The wilderness consumed everything eventually: men, cabins, even memories. That night, Nathaniel sat by his fire and thought about the mathematics of survival. Daniel had been less than 200 yards from safety. 200 yards. A distance a man could walk in 2 minutes under normal circumstances. But in a blizzard, those 200 yards might as well have been 200 miles. The problem wasn't distance, it was direction. In whiteout conditions, a man couldn't maintain a straight line. He would drift, compensating for perceived slopes that didn't exist, following what felt like the right direction but was actually a gradual curve. Within minutes, he would be turned around completely. Within an hour, he could be walking in circles. Nathaniel had heard stories of trappers found frozen within yards of their cabins. He had always assumed those men had panicked or made foolish decisions. Now he understood the truth. They had been victims of simple disorientation. The human body couldn't navigate in zero visibility. It needed reference points, landmarks, something to aim toward. Without those references, even the most experienced woodsman was lost. Daniel Morrison had been proof of that. And if it could happen to Daniel, it could happen to anyone. It could happen to Nathaniel himself. Nathaniel spent the next 3 weeks finishing the trap season alone. The work kept his hands busy, but left his mind free to circle back to the same question. How did a man navigate when he couldn't see? He thought about it while skinning beaver pelts. He thought about it while checking trap lines. He thought about it during the long evenings when the fire burned low and the cabin felt empty without Daniel's presence across the room. Traditional navigation methods were obvious and familiar. Trappers used the sun's position to maintain direction during the day. They read the stars at night. They learned to recognize landmarks, distinctive trees or rock formations or creek bends that marked specific locations. They paid attention to wind direction, knowing that prevailing winds in their region came from certain quarters. They developed an intuitive sense of terrain, feeling whether they were moving uphill or down, sensing the general lay of the land. These methods worked perfectly under normal conditions. But every single one of them became useless in a blizzard. The sun disappeared behind thick clouds and driving snow. Stars were invisible. Landmarks vanished when visibility dropped to arm's length. Wind direction became unreliable because blizzard winds swirled and eddied, changing direction minute by minute. Even terrain sense failed when snow drifts created false slopes and filled hollows, transforming familiar ground into alien landscape. Nathaniel realized that men had been navigating mountains using methods that worked 99 days out of 100. But on that 100th day, when conditions turned severe, all those reliable methods failed simultaneously. He talked to other trappers when he traveled to the trading post in late December to sell his pelts. He asked how they handled navigation in storms. Most admitted they simply waited out bad weather. If caught away from shelter, they would hole up under a tree or behind rocks until visibility improved. It was the sensible approach. But Nathaniel pointed out the obvious flaw. What if you were caught in open terrain with no shelter? What if the storm lasted days instead of hours? What if you were already hypothermic and needed to reach warmth immediately? Waiting wasn't always an option. Some trappers carried compasses. Nathaniel had tried using a compass during a moderate snowstorm and discovered its limitations. A compass told you which direction was north, but it couldn't tell you where your cabin was relative to your current position. If you didn't know your exact starting point, the compass only helped you walk in a straight line toward nowhere in particular. And even maintaining a compass bearing was difficult when you had to stop every few minutes to check the needle with frozen fingers while snow accumulated on the glass. The problem was clear. Men needed a navigation system that worked in zero visibility, that didn't depend on seeing landmarks or sun or stars, that was reliable even when every natural reference point disappeared. Nathaniel couldn't think of any existing system that met those requirements, which meant if he wanted to survive the next serious blizzard, he would have to invent something new. Nathaniel began his experiments in January of 1835. He started with the basic question that would define everything else. What could a man see in a blizzard when he couldn't see anything else? The answer seemed obvious. Something close, something bright, something that contrasted sharply with white snow and gray stormlight. He needed markers that would be visible at short range, even when visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. He collected materials from his supplies and from the forest around his cabin. He tied a strip of red cloth to a tree trunk at chest height and walked away from it during a light snowfall. At 30 feet, the red fabric was clearly visible. At 50 feet, it was still noticeable. At 70 feet, it started to fade into the gray background. At 100 feet, it disappeared completely. The test told him something important. If he spaced markers at intervals of 50 feet or less, he could move from one to the next without losing sight of either. The markers would create a visible chain through conditions that erased everything else. But what material worked best? He tested strips of blanket wool, leather, canvas, and bark. Wool held up well in wind and didn't stiffen too much when wet. Leather was durable but darkened when wet and became less visible. Canvas was tough but flapped in wind and could tear. Bark was worthless, too brittle in cold. Wool emerged as the best option. It was bright when dry, held color well, stayed relatively flexible in freezing temperatures, and was readily available. Trappers always had wool blankets. Scraps could be cut and used without significant loss. Color mattered as much as material. Nathaniel tested red, blue, yellow, and green fabric. Red showed well against white snow but faded in gray stormlight. Blue remained visible in most conditions and contrasted sharply with both snow and pine trees. Yellow was excellent in overcast conditions but could blend with sunset light. Green was surprisingly effective, standing out against snow even though it matched summer foliage. He realized he should use multiple colors. If one color became difficult to see in certain light conditions, another would remain visible. The marker poles themselves required experimentation. He tried short stakes driven into the ground, but snowdrifts buried them quickly. He tested tall poles, 8 to 10 feet high, which remained visible even when several feet of snow accumulated. The poles needed to be sturdy enough to withstand wind, but light enough to transport and install. He settled on straight branches approximately 3 inches in diameter. He stripped the bark to create a smoother surface for attaching fabric and to improve visibility. The pale wood contrasted with dark tree trunks in the forest. Nathaniel spent the rest of that winter testing and refining. He planted experimental markers around his cabin at various distances and in different terrain. He observed them during storms of varying intensity. He noted which configurations worked and which failed. By spring, he had developed a clear understanding of what his system needed to be. Spring of 1835 brought thaw and the end of serious storm danger, but Nathaniel continued developing his marking system. He had identified what worked. Now he needed to create a complete network that could guide him reliably through the worst conditions. The system had to be simple enough to follow under extreme stress and cold, yet sophisticated enough to provide directional information beyond simply marking a trail. He developed a color sequence that would indicate direction. Blue fabric marked the poles closest to his cabin, creating a visual home signal. Red fabric marked poles on his primary trap lines heading south and east. Green fabric marked the western routes toward the creek. By reading the color pattern, Nathaniel could determine not just that he had found a marker, but which direction it was guiding him. If he saw blue, he was near home. If he saw red and then blue, he was heading toward the cabin from the south. The system created a vocabulary written in colored cloth that could be read even through driving snow. Spacing the markers required mathematical precision. During his winter experiments, Nathaniel had determined that 50 feet was the maximum reliable distance between markers in severe conditions. But 50 feet meant he would need hundreds of poles to mark even his nearest trap lines. That was impractical. He compromised at 75 feet between markers on straight sections of trail, reducing to 50 feet at turns or in areas where terrain or vegetation might obscure visibility. At 75-foot intervals, he could mark a 1-mile trail with approximately 70 poles. It was a significant investment of time and materials, but it was manageable. He cut poles throughout the spring, selecting straight growth from young pines and aspens. Each pole was stripped of bark using his knife, a process that took 15 to 20 minutes per pole. He carved a sharp point on one end for driving into ground or snow. The other end he left blunt. The poles averaged 8 feet in length, too short and they would disappear under snow drifts. Too tall and they would be difficult to transport and plant securely. 8 feet was the balance point. The fabric markers were cut from old blankets and spare clothing. Each strip was approximately 4 inches wide and 2 feet long. Nathaniel wrapped them around the poles at chest height, the level most visible when walking through deep snow. He tied them securely with multiple knots, knowing that wind would test every connection. 3 colors on each pole created a pattern: blue on top, red in middle, green on bottom near the bases. The repeating pattern made each marker recognizable even if snow obscured part of the pole. In May, Nathaniel began planting his network. He started at his cabin and worked outward, measuring distances by pacing. 75 paces between markers on straight sections, 50 paces at turns. He drove each pole 2 feet into the ground, deep enough to remain stable through winter winds and freeze-thaw cycles. The work was methodical and time-consuming. He completed the first route to his southern trap line in 3 days. Robert Hutchins was the first trapper to see Nathaniel's marker network. He arrived at Nathaniel's cabin in early June, traveling through the area on his way to summer hunting grounds. He noticed the colored poles immediately. They were impossible to miss, standing 8 feet tall with bright fabric strips wrapped around them, creating a line of markers that stretched away from the cabin toward the southern trap lines. Robert studied them with visible confusion before asking what Nathaniel was building. Nathaniel explained the system. He described Daniel's death, the problem of navigation in blizzards, and his solution. Robert listened politely, then pointed out the obvious criticism. Blizzards were temporary. A man caught in a storm could wait it out. Building an elaborate network of marked trails seemed like tremendous effort to solve a problem that occurred maybe 2 or 3 times per winter. The time spent cutting poles and planting markers could be better used trapping, hunting, or improving the cabin. Robert's tone wasn't hostile, just practical. He was pointing out what seemed like common sense. Other trappers who passed through offered similar observations. Charles Brennan, an experienced mountain man who had survived 12 winters, suggested that Nathaniel was overreacting to a single tragedy. Men died in the mountains. It was the nature of the life they had chosen. Building elaborate safety systems wouldn't change that fundamental reality. Charles believed in accepting risk rather than trying to engineer it away. William Fletcher, a trapper who worked the area north of Nathaniel's territory, joked that the colored poles looked like decorations for some kind of festival. He asked if Nathaniel was planning to invite people to a celebration in the middle of nowhere. The criticism didn't anger Nathaniel. He understood their perspective. To men who hadn't watched a partner freeze to death 200 yards from safety, his marker system did seem excessive. The poles were visually obvious, almost absurd in their brightness and scale. They were impossible to ignore, which made them easy to mock. And the amount of work involved was substantial. Nathaniel had invested weeks of labor into cutting, stripping, and planting poles. From the outside, it looked like obsessive behavior, like a man who couldn't move past a tragedy. But Nathaniel continued expanding his network anyway. By late summer of 1835, he had marked all his primary trap lines, creating routes that extended up to 3 miles from his cabin in various directions. He marked the path to the creek where he drew water. He marked the route to a backup shelter he maintained in a small cave 2 miles east. He marked the trail to the nearest neighbor's cabin, though that neighbor thought Nathaniel was wasting his time. The network grew until Nathaniel could reach any important location from his cabin by following colored markers, never moving more than 75 feet between visible poles. He tested the system during autumn rains when visibility dropped and fog rolled through the valleys. The markers worked perfectly. He could navigate confidently in conditions that would have made him cautious before. The real test would come in winter, when the blizzards returned. The blizzard that struck in January of 1836 became known throughout the northern Rocky Mountain trapping community as the three-day storm. It began on January 19th with light snow and moderate wind. By midday, the wind had increased to a steady gale. By evening, visibility had dropped to zero. The storm continued without pause for 72 hours, dumping snow measured in feet rather than inches and driving wind that created drifts taller than a man. Nathaniel had been checking his eastern trap line when the storm intensified. He was 4 miles from his cabin, farther than he had ever been from shelter when weather turned severe. He finished pulling 2 beaver from traps and started back immediately, reading the deteriorating conditions with the instinct of 9 winters in the mountains. But the storm moved faster than he did. Within an hour, he couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The world had become a howling white chaos that erased landmarks, trails, and all sense of direction. He stopped walking and stood still, forcing himself to think rather than panic. 4 miles from his cabin. In clear weather, that was an easy 90-minute walk. In these conditions, it could take 6 hours or more, assuming he could find his way at all. Without his marker system, he would be doing exactly what Daniel had done 2 years earlier. He would be guessing at direction, drifting gradually off course, walking in circles until exhaustion claimed him. But he had markers. They were out here somewhere, planted along the trail he had been following. Nathaniel moved forward slowly, scanning the white chaos for any sign of color. The wind drove snow horizontally, stinging his exposed skin and making it difficult to keep his eyes open. He walked perhaps 50 feet before he saw it. A flash of blue fabric whipping in the wind. He nearly cried with relief. The marker pole stood exactly where he had planted it 6 months earlier, the colored strips still secured, despite the wind trying to tear them free. He reached the pole and gripped it with both hands, catching his breath. The fabric was frozen, stiff, but intact. The pole itself was solid, driven deep enough that the wind couldn't dislodge it. Nathaniel oriented himself, turned in the direction he knew the next marker would be, and started walking. 75 feet. That was the distance he had measured and paced out during installation. He counted his steps, compensating for the deeper snow that made each step shorter than normal. At 90 paces, the next pole appeared through the driving snow. The journey home took 5 hours. Nathaniel moved from marker to marker, never losing sight of one pole before the next appeared. The colored fabric strips were visible even through the worst of the blizzard, bright points of reference in a world that had become completely featureless. When he finally saw the blue markers that indicated proximity to his cabin, he felt exhaustion hit him like a physical weight. Nathaniel reached his cabin after dark on the first night of the storm. He secured the door, built up his fire, and waited out the remaining 2 days listening to wind hammer against the log walls. He had food, water, firewood, and shelter. He was safe. But he thought about the other trappers scattered throughout the territory, men who might have been caught away from their cabins when the storm hit, men who didn't have colored markers to guide them home through the white darkness. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, Nathaniel ventured out to assess the damage and check on his neighbors. The snow had drifted in places to heights of 6 and 7 feet. His marker poles were still visible, though many were buried to half their height. The colored fabric strips remained intact. The system had survived conditions more severe than anything he had tested during development. He found Marcus Wade 2 days after the storm ended. Marcus had been a trapper for 7 years, experienced and careful. His cabin was located 5 miles west of Nathaniel's camp. Marcus had been caught checking his northern trap line when the blizzard hit. He had tried to make it back to his cabin. His body was found 150 yards from his door, frozen in a sitting position against a fallen log. The tracks around him told the familiar story. He had wandered in loops and circles, disoriented, probably convinced he was walking toward safety while actually moving parallel to it. Peter Lindholm's body was discovered a week later by a group of trappers who had gathered to search for missing men. Peter had been checking his western trap line and had tried to reach a backup shelter he maintained in a rock overhang 3 miles from his main cabin. He had gotten within 50 yards of the shelter before losing his way. The tracks showed he had passed within sight of the rocks multiple times, circling the area but never quite finding the entrance. He had died of exposure within minutes of safety, another victim of disorientation in zero visibility. Robert Hutchins survived, but only because of extraordinary luck. He had been caught 4 miles from his cabin when the storm hit and had tried to navigate using his compass and dead reckoning. After 6 hours of walking, he had stumbled into a small grove of dense pines that provided marginal shelter from the wind. He had stayed there for 5 days, burning through his emergency supplies and nearly freezing before the weather cleared enough for him to determine his location. When he finally made it back to his cabin, he had severe frostbite on 3 fingers and both feet. He would recover, but the experience had changed him. The trapping community held an informal gathering in late February at the main trading post. 17 trappers attended. They discussed the storm, shared stories of where they had been when it hit, and mourned the men who hadn't survived. The conversation eventually turned to Nathaniel's marker system and how he had navigated home through conditions that had killed others. Robert Hutchins visited Nathaniel's cabin in March of 1836, as soon as he could travel after recovering from his frostbite. He had lost the tips of 2 fingers and had permanent damage to his left foot that gave him a slight limp. He sat by Nathaniel's fire and asked detailed questions about the marker system. How far apart were the poles? What type of wood worked best? How deep did they need to be planted? Where did Nathaniel get the colored fabric? How did he determine which routes to mark first? Nathaniel answered every question. He took Robert outside and showed him the markers, explaining the color-coding system and the spacing mathematics. He demonstrated how the fabric was wrapped and tied to withstand wind. He explained why he had chosen 8-foot poles rather than shorter stakes or taller structures. Robert listened with the intensity of a man who had nearly died and was determined never to repeat the experience. Before he left, he asked if Nathaniel would help him build a similar network around his own cabin and trap lines. They worked together for 2 weeks. Nathaniel showed Robert how to select straight poles, how to strip bark efficiently, and how to cut fabric strips to the right dimensions. They paced out Robert's primary routes and planted markers at measured intervals. Robert's network was smaller than Nathaniel's, covering only his most frequently traveled paths, but it was enough to provide navigation in severe conditions. When they finished, Robert had a system that could save his life the next time a blizzard caught him away from shelter. Word spread through the trapping community. Charles Brennan, who had mocked Nathaniel's efforts the previous summer, arrived in April asking for advice. He had known both Marcus Wade and Peter Lindholm. Their deaths had affected him deeply, forcing him to reconsider his philosophy about accepting risk. He wanted to build markers around his cabin. William Fletcher came in May with similar requests. Other trappers stopped by throughout the spring and summer, asking questions, examining Nathaniel's network, and taking notes about construction techniques. Nathaniel shared everything freely. He wasn't trying to profit from his innovation or claim ownership of the idea. He was simply offering a solution to a problem that had killed men he knew. He helped some trappers plan their networks, suggesting which routes should be marked first based on distance from shelter and frequency of travel. He explained variations for different terrain, noting that markers needed closer spacing in dense forest and could be farther apart in open areas where visibility extended further, even in storms. By the fall of 1836, at least a dozen trappers in the northern Rockies had installed marker networks around their cabins and primary trap lines. The systems varied in details, with each trapper adapting the basic concept to his specific needs and available materials. Some used different color combinations. Others experimented with pole heights or spacing patterns, but the fundamental principle remained consistent. Colored markers placed at regular intervals could guide a man home through conditions that erased every other form of navigation. The marker system saved William Fletcher's life in the winter of 1837. He was caught 3 miles from his cabin during a sudden storm and followed his colored poles home through visibility that never exceeded 15 feet. Charles Brennan credited his markers with guiding him safely through 2 separate blizzards during the winter of 1838. Robert Hutchins, who had nearly died in the storm that killed Marcus Wade and Peter Lindholm, trapped successfully for another 19 years, navigating confidently through conditions that would have terrified him before he built his network. Nathaniel continued trapping until 1844, when declining beaver populations and changing fashion markets ended the profitable era of Rocky Mountain fur trade. He left the mountains with money saved from his best years and established a small farm in the foothills of the Bitterroot Range. He married a widow named Catherine, who had 3 children from her first marriage. They had 2 children together. He lived quietly, farming in summer, hunting in winter, rarely speaking about his years as a mountain man. But the marker networks remained in the mountains. Trappers who had learned the system from Nathaniel continued using and maintaining their poles. New trappers arriving in the region saw the colored markers and asked about them, learning the technique from men who had learned it from Nathaniel or from someone who had. The system spread beyond the northern Rockies, carried by trappers who moved to new territories and built new networks around new cabins. Variations appeared. Some men used flags instead of wrapped fabric. Others developed different color codes or spacing patterns. But the core principle persisted. By the 1850s, when prospectors began moving into the mountains searching for gold, they found abandoned trapping camps marked with colored poles and adopted the system for their own use. Mining camps in remote locations planted marker networks to guide men between diggings and shelter. Settlers moving west discovered that the markers worked equally well for guiding them between homesteads and water sources or between isolated farms and the nearest town. The technique that Nathaniel had developed to solve one specific problem proved adaptable to many situations where navigation in harsh conditions meant the difference between life and death. Nathaniel Carver died in 1869 at age 57 from pneumonia. He was buried in a small cemetery near his farm. His gravestone listed his name, his birth and death years, and nothing else. None of his family knew the details of his trapping years or understood that he had invented something that had saved dozens of lives. To them, he was simply a husband, father, and farmer who had once worked in the mountains before settling into ordinary life. But in the high country, where winter storms still erased the world in white chaos, colored markers stood silent watch along old trails, guiding travelers home through conditions that killed the unprepared. The system Nathaniel built to survive one more winter after watching Daniel Morrison die had become part of the forgotten wisdom of the American frontier. Passed quietly from one generation to the next, without fanfare or recognition, simply because it worked.